You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Cynthia Toolin-Wilson on my show, Author to Author. And today I'm talking with Lucy Healy, who wrote a very interesting historical novel called The Guest of Night. Hi, Lucy. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. So we're having this interview in the time of COVID, so I'm wondering how much of an issue that is in your country.
Well, that depends who you ask. There are still cases of illness being reported, and there are a great many restrictions in place on almost every aspect of life. So it's very much still a live issue. I mean, my family, we haven't been directly touched by the disease, and we haven't been touched as badly as some by the various restrictions. But obviously it's restricted our family, our life with our extended family and our social life, and has affected how we work, although thus far not the fact that we are in work. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a difficult time for everybody, and certainly it's true here in the United States also. So, Lucy, would you like to start us with a prayer, and then we'll start talking about your book?
Okay. So I'm going to use a prayer written by St. Thomas Aquinas, known as the prayer before study. I know we're not exactly studying, but I like this prayer. Creator of all things, true source of light and wisdom, lofty origin of all being, graciously let a ray of your brilliance penetrate into the darkness of my understanding. Give me a sharp sense of understanding, a retentive memory, and the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally. Grant me the talent of being exact in my explanations, and the ability to express myself with thoroughness and charm. Point out the beginning, direct the progress, and help in completion. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. So, Lucy, how long have you been writing?
This was my first substantial creative writing project. I suppose I've been writing sort of short stories, kind of as practice, if you like, for my own benefit or for one or two other people, on and off for quite a long time. But yeah, short form fiction is quite a good way of learning to write. The novel has had a long gestation because essentially I learnt to write by writing it. I did not know how to write at all. Not technique, structure, how to make what ends up on the page actually correspond at all to what's in your mind, all those things. So I basically learnt to write by writing it. So, yeah.
Wow. So you never went to a MFA program or anything like that?
No, I've not had any formal. No, I've not had any formal training in creative writing. I've benefited from obviously the comments and criticism of one or two writers who've seen this work, and so that's obviously been very helpful and very important. And their positive comments obviously is very important to me to have confidence in my work, and likewise sort of criticisms are useful to have, very useful to have. I did study English literature at university, so I've had that training.
Very good. Yeah. So you certainly, if the end product is well written, so if you learned how to write during this book, you did a good job. So that's good. Yeah, so would you like to tell us some things about your book? I know it's a historical novel, so I mean, what kind of time period and what attracted you to that?
Well, it's set in Elizabethan England, and Elizabethan England is a time of religious conflict. It's a society that is imbued with Christianity, but is torn by conflict within Christianity, between Protestant and Catholic. That's not a time that any Christians, I think, would really like to revisit. But it's a time that happened, and it's therefore something that we need to, I think, understand with kind of mutual respect and mutual charity. And the book does focus on some Catholic characters who are they're Catholics in Elizabethan England at a time when the practice of Catholicism was illegal. All the acts of sacramental worship were illegal. And there were also lethal penalties attached to certain things. It's not as simple as saying you could get executed for being a Catholic. You could get executed for very specific acts, which which is pretty much impossible for Catholics to exist without. So in effect, the survival of Catholicism depended on people being prepared to commit these capital crimes. And so it's great for the historian because there's a lot of complexity and trying to work out why some people got executed and other people seem to get away with things, and which laws are being used against which people in which way. It's wondrously and sometimes frustratingly interesting, and it's certainly not something you can grasp very quickly. This situation and how it actually operates, because there's always a big gap between, in an early modern state, there's a big gap between what the law is and what actually happens on the ground. And sometimes what may happen on the ground is a lot less severe than the laws might imply. On the other hand, at other times, it may be a lot more severe than you'd gather from the official record, because you can have officials who are sort of acting at their own discretion. You can have, so historians who've worked a lot on the financial penalties that were paid by Catholics, and will say, well, we can work out roughly how much reached the Exchequer in London. We have no idea, or little idea, how much money was paid over by Catholics that never got to London because it was trousered by various officials along the way. And we have sort of one or two examples where we do happen to know, and that suggests that there's a whole hinterland of minor conflict, persecution, I suppose, which is very difficult for us to quantify or trace. So that's the situation. I suppose I should just say that the main laws against Catholics which sort of resulted in executions was that from 1585 it was illegal for a person who'd been ordained a priest overseas, which is all of them because there are no seminaries in England. So it was illegal for someone who had been ordained a priest to enter the country, re-enter the country. That was a treason. If you were caught, that was treason, that you were a priest and you'd entered the country. And it was also a felony, which meant a capital offence. In those days, by definition, a felony is capital, to aid or abet or to harbour the priest. So what that means effectively is that if a priest comes to your house and says mass, then you're both liable. Potentially you both hang. And if you don't, but of course, much of the time people don't, and that's because you get good at hiding and evading and bribing and all those other things that people do. So that's the kind of basic background. And I think I obviously was attracted to telling a story which had that as a background, because I think it's fascinating. It's got great potential because we know so much, and we can also imagine what we can't quantify exactly. And also, I suppose I feel that the experience of Catholics is and how they actually were treated and so on is perhaps the one of the tales less told of English history.
Yeah. So it's always interesting when you have religious liberties taken away or even oppression. And I think that although your book is written about the past, I think we'd be silly not to realize that some of that still occurs in countries, and if it doesn't, that we're always at risk of having it occur. I teach Eritreans online, and they have, even though Catholicism is an accepted religion in Eritrea, it is not really an accepted religion. So it's just interesting to see that although you're writing about the past, this still occurs and could raise its ugly head again in a much more severe manner with the means that we have now of tracking people and that sort of thing. It could be actually much worse. So in a way, your book is very timely. So I think it would make people think, how much religious freedom do we have and how much is it actually guaranteed in different countries. So,
it's true. There's always, when I'm studying this topic, which I do for a living, it does sometimes you sort of stop short and think that this is is in the past, but it's also real in various countries around the world. One could point to countries where these types of laws. For example, in England, there was a law. It wasn't automatically capital to be a Catholic, but one of the lethal laws was that people who had effectively become Catholics, if they'd been reconciled, to be reconciled to the Church of Rome was capital. And one could cite countries where there is precisely that law, that Christian communities may exist, but it is on paper at least capital if you convert to Christianity, and that is not religious freedom.
No.
And I think I think it's important to remember that you can have a sort of bare toleration of existence, which is still very oppressive. I think it's also important to remember that, of course, we're talking about early modern Europe, and in early modern Europe it would be difficult to find a country where there was religious freedom.
Sure.
And, England saw major lethal persecution of Protestants in the mid-century under Mary I, who was a Catholic, of course. Other Catholic countries saw lethal persecution of Protestants. France, partly because Protestantism was not tolerated there, except to some degree after the Edict of Nantes. But France, as well as non-toleration of Protestantism, saw horrific violence during their wars of religion, which did occur on both sides. It wasn't only done. Some people would get the impression that it was only ever done by Catholics against the French Protestants. That's not really quite true. It cut both ways. The massacres occurred on both sides. So I think it's important to. I'm telling this story, but by telling this story, I'm not trying to devalue any of the other stories.
Oh no.
And I think one of the things where you always get slightly impatient, I'm afraid, with the people that I study historically is this kind of you can sympathise with them right up to the point where basically they cannot see a problem with people of the wrong religion being banned and proscribed and prosecuted. They really do. They really tended not to see it, and so it was quite a long, slow development before to reach a point where people were saying that there should be toleration of the practice of different religions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's funny because I think they don't really see. You kind of say, well, this is a double standard. You think that it's outrageous if your worship is banned, but it's sort of right and proper to prosecute them for their worship. And I'm afraid they'd kind of look at you funny and say, well, yeah, of course it's a double standard. We're right, they're wrong. So that's and I think, I don't know really how that played out in real people's real actual hearts. I suppose I tried to hint at it a little bit in the book of how people might have actually managed those contradictions. And I think part of the reason why more people didn't get slaughtered, frankly, was because day to day in their actual lives, people did have empathy with each other. Even though on paper and in theory, they would have said false religions should be prosecuted.
Yes.
Sometimes, of course, they didn't, and they were prepared to pursue each other ruthlessly. But I think, more people didn't get slaughtered because people had more empathy than perhaps they had in theory.
Yes, I agree. I mean, certainly, if you look at the more recent Holocaust, there are many stories of people who knew that harboring a Jew would be death, and yet worked to save Jews, even though they weren't Jewish, So I do think it's true that sometimes people do have empathy, and sometimes the empathy is so strong that they will risk their own lives. So it's kind of a bright light that we can see when we look at these very negative situations. Not everybody buys into the party line, so to speak. So there is hope there sometimes. But anyway, back to your story. So, so you have some major characters, and would you like to tell us about some of them?
Yes, I suppose my main characters are they are teenagers who are trying to grow up. They're peering over the borders of childhood into the adult world, and they understand it more than their parents think they do, but also rather less than their parents think they do. And that's partly why the drama that occurs in the novel does occur, because they understand more and less. So they're aware of the conflicts around them. They're drawn. Two of the young people are Catholic. The other one is not. And they are drawn by this sort of the cause. It's a cause they believe in. They're sort of aware that their parents, they're well aware that their parents kind of break the law as a way of life. And so they understand danger, but they don't understand fully the ins and outs of what their parents are negotiating. And that's why they sort of get drawn into the networks of hidden Catholicism. And they get drawn in quite deep, and they know what they're doing, but they don't. And this is how they find themselves in a situation that becomes really deeply threatening. And I think but not to them, to their family, to their parents. And I suppose the novel's about Elizabethan Catholics, but it's about growing up. Now, most of us won't have the chance to end up sticking our parents under a noose, but just this sense of teenagers who, and I think this is true of some teenagers, not all, but I think it's true of some teenagers who don't sort of not care. They actually care quite deeply, and they really want to do the right thing. But they're also teenagers, and there are all sorts of other emotions going on there. And it's about growing up. It's about messing things up out of actually the strength of your desire to do good.
Yeah. That makes a lot of
sense.
They
really want to do good, and somehow it all goes wrong. Mm-hmm. So I suppose in a way you could say that's a little bit bitter, but I try not to make it all bitter. I think I've tried to suggest that that there is perhaps the naivety of the way they experience faith and friendship can't survive contact with the real world. But that doesn't mean that friendship and faith can't survive. But they will be transformed into something more grown up. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of where I'm taking it. Where we're going by the end of the novel is you have to leave a certain childhood behind, but perhaps you'll rediscover them over that border into the other world, into the adult world. Sorry, but they'll be transformed. Yeah, and I suppose some of this must somehow chime with like my memories of being a teenager. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it chimes with some other teenagers as well, of desperately wanting to do the right thing but never knowing when you're going to mess up, and mm-hmm. wondering whether there can be, whether your mess ups can be redeemed. Right. Yeah.
So they really they lack both the knowledge necessary to do what they want to, and the self-confidence.
The self-confidence, and perhaps also just the wisdom, the self mm-hmm. and the self-knowledge. Yeah. I think also I'm not, wasn't really interested in writing a novel where you kind of line up all the heroes on one side and they're whiter than white, and then you line up the villains on the other side and they're whiter than white, and they're blacker than black, and they're all as flat as pancakes, and not because that's not how it was. That's not any bad literature. That's just not how it was in the English Reformation, that you can just line up good on one side and bad on the other. So that's, I try not to do that. I sort of want the reader to understand that pretty much everyone in the novel has a reason to come from where they're coming from, mm-hmm. and a reason to be as they are, and they can all be sympathized with. That's why in the novel one of the characters has a really bitter memory of the persecution of Protestants 30 years before under Queen Mary, and that needed to be on stage, as it were. That needed to be shown because it's why she is as she is. And I think you just it's trying to understand why real people really might do things. And there's another incident where this came absolutely from a historical text, from a primary source. The report that there was a priest in Gloucester, which is the city where I set some of the action. It's a lovely old English county town, but so a priest in Gloucester was sort of being coming out from having been tried, and the contemporary source says that some little boys sort of were gathered in the street, and they were calling names and throwing dung at this priest. And so you read that and you think, well, you could write that from the point of view of the priest, I suppose, or I could write that from the point of view of some Catholic who was, watching and was shocked and angry and whatever, I don't know. Or you could write it from the viewpoint of the little boys and try and understand why they might do that. Yeah. And it's not because they're demons incarnate, or because they're just full of malice. Why might you do? I mean, there's no getting away that that's not a nice thing to do to anyone. Right. But why do they do it? And let's try and understand and understand them, why you might do that and how you might feel about it afterwards, and that real people might really think they had a good reason to behave in that way.
Yeah, that's really an important point about those kids, because really, and I mean it would also apply to adults. I don't think that people are necessarily deliberately evil. They're, some people of course are, but I don't think that people in that kind of situation are deliberately evil. They probably really think they're doing the correct thing. So what they are is really misinformed. Whether it's children who have heard things at the dinner table, or, adults who believe, for instance, in this country, people listen to one political party or the other, and, they go on and live their lives a certain way. So I don't know that it's evil things happen, bad things happen. But I don't know that it's always because the people that are doing them are deliberately doing evil things. They think they're doing the right thing.
Yes, and at least if they don't think, if it's not that they'll sort of think it's right, at least they genuinely think that the people they're doing it to are worse, are doing much worse things to them.
Yes,
and it's somehow just right. And so, and I suppose in a way, the fact that people who are not evil can do bad things, in some ways it's a bit depressing, because you sort of think, well, being a basically good, well-intentioned person doesn't mean that someone won't do awful things. So that's kind of depressing, because it means that, well, I suppose none of us are safe from going out and doing appalling things, or the fact that that most people you live with are good people doesn't mean that they will never join in with something terribly wrong. On the other hand, I suppose, on a kind of spiritual level, perhaps it's sort of reassuring, because, if people aren't totally evil, even though they're doing these evil things, then, perhaps perhaps they're not fully morally responsible, and perhaps there's the scope for redemption there. Whereas if everyone who does sort of palpably unkind or wrong or violent things is deliberately and fully and knowingly malicious, well, there's not a lot of hope for them, is there?
Yeah, it's. I think also when you think of a scene with young children or teenagers even doing something mean or evil, a lot of times what's really happened is you have gang mentality. So, one person starts it, and the next thing the whole group joins in.
Yeah.
So, it's an interesting phenomenon that I guess has been with the human race since original sin. Yeah.
Yes.
So.
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So please continue.
Well, what else? I mean, what would you like to talk about? What sort of questions about the book? Because I sort of wrote it, so I've lived with it, so I sort of know it. But sort of what might strike someone else coming to it that they might wonder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Was there anything in it that you thought, was there anything in it that you wondered whether that was real or made up? Because there's bits of both.
Well, obviously I knew I was reading fiction, so I knew that, yes, it was made up. But I think that how realistic was it? And I would have to say that as I read through, I found myself saying, yes, that could happen. So it wasn't like I didn't get to a point where I said, oh, that's ridiculous, that couldn't have happened. Of course, taking into account that we're talking about a different time period and also a country that's very different from the United States, especially, when you think back. I think that I didn't have anything that made me say, gee, that's just not something that could have happened. I did find, this is quite a large book. It's 279 pages on my computer.
Yeah.
Which is good. It gives people, that gives the opportunity to give a lot of development to the topic from different perspectives. I think this, let's see, what page am I on? 27, where Richard and Bridget are talking, and she's been reading, basically he says, don't read things that scare you, and then also, Bridget, let's not lose our wits in fear. They were, 12 police sent to England from Reims last year.
Yeah.
That is one of us. The worst will not happen to all of us, not even to most of us. So interestingly, I could see that kind of, okay, I'm going to comfort you, and I couldn't help but wondering, is he really that confident, that things will be all right? So I mean, there's a little bit of a tease there, if you will, because you want to know, okay, what's going to happen. But it touches humanity. I think that this whole passage touches humanity in a special way. And again, I return to the Holocaust, which is a time of particular interest for me. And it's like, how many people were like, they're not going to find us, or it will never get that bad, or they waited to leave, not just Germany, but a lot of Europe, until it was too late. So it's like you're touching something that's very human here, the fear that you're going to be persecuted for what you are, but yet you love what you are, so, and how that plays out in a relationship between two people. So it's very interesting. Very interesting writing. Very good writing.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I was trying to convey there is that there's always this sense of what I know as a historian and wondering how it felt at the time. Now, we know, cause we can do the sums with some accuracy, and we reckon that about, in this period of lethal persecution, we reckon about 1 in 5 of the seminary priests that came to England as missionaries, about 1 in 5 of them got executed.
Yeah.
So that's not a suicide mission, but it's a very real risk, right?
Yeah.
you have to reckon with the possibility that you might be the fifth. At the same time, how it felt to the missionary priests at the time, well, they can't know what the total body count's going to be in the end. Perhaps the persecution's going to get worse and worse, and they're all going to be scooped up. Perhaps it's going to carry on sort of as it is, and lots of people will run and hide for quite a long time. Some people will get tossed in jail and sort of half forgotten about, so they'll never actually get executed, that kind of thing. So, on the other hand, if you were at the college in Reims, you would know that reports were coming back fairly regularly of people being executed. So you would always live with that possibility. I mean, perhaps it's not bad analogy. It's a bit like joining the army in a time when there's not a major war. If you get deployed, your family are going to be thinking he might not come back. You're going to be thinking, I might not come back. But you know that most of you will come back. Yeah. But you can't promise them that you won't be the one that doesn't.
Yeah.
And my best guess is that it must have felt something like that. The sort of ironic twist, of course, is that for these English priests, you're not saying goodbye to your family and heading off to the front line. Your family is the front line.
Yeah. That's a very good point.
And so that's the difference. That when you come back to them, then they are the front line.
Yeah. So that's a very good point. You know, we don't tend to think of the family relationship or the relationship of friends in a small area. We don't think of it as the front line, but actually they are when you refer to it this way. They are on the front line because of what they are. You know. So again, you know, what you're saying to me resonates with all of humanity, not just with this type of religious persecution or this historical religious persecution. Whenever persecution occurs, I guess, I'm just speaking off the top of my head, but whenever persecution exists for some reason, religion, social, political, those who believe and are deemed as being on the wrong side or deemed as being the enemy really are at the front line, even if they're sitting in their living room. It's kind of scary. But I think it's... That's a really good point. Really good point. So, let's see. And then you go down a little further to this part that starts starting to look at the break here, but let's see. Let's see, where Bridget says, she's asked, have you any understanding of the world at all? Do you not know that you cannot play with fire? And then the mother, the interaction between her and the mother, I find that very interesting too. You know, the intimate family relationship between mother and daughter in a crisis, so to speak.
Yeah, I suppose there's a disjunction there in that they sort of both know what the situation is, but the girl hasn't got the same. She's not living with it in quite the same way. She hasn't really grasped, how things are. Now, of course, she does the slightly foolhardy thing she does before she's had that conversation with her brother, when perhaps the sort of reality of the situation kind of hits her in a new way. Oh heck, people actually die. So there is that, but I suppose it also comes to character differences as well. That anybody who is still practicing a religion that's been banned has a degree of bloody-mindedness and a considerable degree of courage. But there's also, variations in the way people approach that. And there are people who really can't. They find the whole thing miserable, but there's a sort of moral imperative that they can't get away from. Perhaps there's a sense of obligation as well. She's not thrilled by the fact that her son has sort of chosen this dangerous vocation, but he has, and so she'll be letting him down if she doesn't keep practicing her religion. Mm-hmm. But she's frightened constantly. She's constantly nervous. And there are people like that. And then in the same community, there'll be other people who just temperamentally, they have more of a dangerous spirit. And they want to needle the persecutor a bit. They like the idea of they're angry at their own sort of what they see as injustice, and so there's a bit of them that kind of enjoys breaking the law because even if, as you hope, they don't find out, it's socking it to them, and so there's differences of temperament even within a group of people who are kind of all operating on the same principle, which is that they're prepared to break the law. And there's also degrees of breaking the law. Is that like, well, I might go to Mass, but I probably wouldn't have a priest in my house. I might have this book, but I won't have that book, because that book's more polemical, it's more provocative, and it's more dangerous. Or well, that was sort of borderline last year, but this year it's way too dangerous and we're not doing that. Mm-hmm. And so, I suppose I just wanted to kind of explore those complexities and let them air. But again, I want you to empathise. I want you to both empathise and be irritated with all those different approaches.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, so as I look here, we're on page 37 of 279. Or we're in that vicinity. So give us a little bit more of the plot line here.
Remind me where we are at page 37.
Well, I just went past that now. Hold on, I got to go back. Okay. So the mother had just said something about if I had, I wouldn't have told, I would not have let him go at all, or something to that effect.
Oh yeah.
Mhm. So it's Christmas. That's about Christmas. Yeah.
Oh yeah. That's where I got to. Yeah. So we've got a situation that I set up early on, which again, I'm working from, as far as I can make it out, the historical context of what actually happened, which is that 1588, the Spanish Armada the Spanish are known to be gearing up to invade England. This has much to do with religion, because Elizabeth I of England is kind of the figurehead Protestant leader. Philip II is sees himself as the leader of the Catholic world, and Elizabeth had been interfering and funding and encouraging revolt in the Low Countries, the Netherlands, which were ruled by Spain. Philip had been fairly directly involved in fomenting revolt in Ireland, which was, I suppose, the opposite number to the Netherlands, because it's ruled from England. But it has a largely Catholic population. So there's there's a military situation which has much to do with religion. And around that time, of course, a lot of Catholics got effectively interned. They were locked up, and it was, as far as I can tell, they were particularly concerned to look up the gentry, so the landowning classes, of whom there were, a number were Catholic. So the Catholic landowning classes were very important to the survival of Catholicism. It wasn't all and only about them, but they were important because they had the money and the space and the premises that they could host priests. They could create Catholic households and employ other Catholics. And to an extent, they could take a few risks because they had a certain social standing that protected them up to a point, but also made them visible. So it was a two-edged sword being of that class, because on the one hand, your social standing gives you a certain freedom and a certain entitlement, but on the other hand, it means you are quite visible. So as I think fairly realistically, my character Hugh, his father has been locked up, and for reasons that we don't quite understand, or that Hugh doesn't quite understand, he has not yet come back. The invasion's over. The Spanish fleet got scattered by a storm.
Right.
There's no immediate danger. Some people are they're bargaining, they're sort of making petitions, they're negotiating their release. Mm-hmm. His father's not come home. And I'm positing that some people, weren't released, and it was Elizabethan England was governed on personal connections. You didn't just treat everybody equally before the law, and so I'm positing that someone doesn't like Hugh's father, and so he's made negative reports about him and said, look, this one, he's a really dangerous Catholic. Mm-hmm. And then that's where you get into local networks and local politics, and who doesn't like who, and who's in with who, and which faction is more powerful in London at the moment. And all these things can be swirling around in ways that historians like to spend many thousands of hours trying to work out. But we can't always work out exactly what's been going on, and exactly why one person seems to spend half his life in prison and other people seem not to. Mm-hmm. So that situation, that Hugh's father has, so far keeps getting away with things, but he's sort of walking a quite narrow footbridge, and he knows it. And so it's quite a driving force in the novel that he is in prison for much of it, and then he comes home, and then in some ways this is obviously good, but in other ways it kind of increases the potential danger for things that can go wrong. Mm-hmm. But again, the novel's about being a teenager, and how much of this does Hugh understand? Well, some, but not a lot. And what's his main reaction is he's angry and he's frightened, but he doesn't really know the precise reasons behind all of this. In fact, he's probably more angry than frightened, because he's still young enough to kind of unconsciously assume that his personal life is not going to fall apart.
Right. So you've got so much research in here. Really?
Well, I mean, this is something I rarely confess when I'm sort of talking about my novel, but because I'm always worried it'll sort of put people off. But this is my professional life, I am a historian, and I wrote my doctorate on Catholic children in post-Reformation England. So, Hugh and Bridget and Stephen are not real, but I know their real counterparts. I know their historical counterparts. I wrote the book. I mean, I literally wrote the book. So in a sense, the research, I've got no excuses if I have made any howlers, because the research for this kind of is my job. So the writing the actual novel was, I suppose, what I did in my spare time. I used to have spare time before I had children.
Yeah, so, when you think of the amount of research, I mean, you have a doctorate in history, so, the research must come, you know how to do it, obviously, but you've made it, I'm sure you've read historical novels where you could, fall asleep. Well, I suppose you might not, you're a historian, but where there's so much detail that it's actually distracting to the story. Here, it's I can picture the setting, if you will, I guess we'd say, the historical setting. I can imagine what these people were wearing, because of the time period, and it's not at all distracting. It's almost, I wouldn't say it's like watching a movie, but it's in the same kind of thing where you have, you're not being, it's okay, this is a historian who wrote a novel. No, this is a novelist who wrote a historical novel. I mean, it's very good writing. And all of this, I'm a sociologist originally, so I know about research, and I can see this is not coming from your imagination, how you're describing these things. So it's quite well. It's masterfully put together.
Thank you. I hope so. I just I mean, obviously that's what I wanted. I didn't want to be doing a history lesson with some bits of dialogue, and I think I remember one of the best things that someone who read it said to me is when you research, you're trying to do your background research for a historical novel, and you say to yourself, because I know that, I don't need to put it in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you know the detail, once you know the details of, the physical things like the clothes, the architecture, you don't put them in. You don't need to. At least, they don't need to be there explicitly. And I mean, it's also true that, of course, to write a novel, I do have to research things that I wouldn't research otherwise. I'm not a historian of architecture, but I needed to have some idea, what the building. I'm not usually a historian of clothes, but I had to try and get a handle on that. You have to suddenly get a handle on things that a lot of, even as a historian, you don't always have to read. Sometimes suddenly I had to I know people wrote letters because I've read their letters, but how do you get a letter from one place to another? Now I'll have to read up on that. So on the other hand, there are some things that do come naturally. I think it was easy. It was not so hard to get a feel for the language because you just do pick that up when you read a lot of contemporary documents. You just do pick that up. Not so much. I haven't tried to do a full imitation of Elizabethan English because if I did, no one would understand it, and it would not translate. But you have to have a sense that it doesn't feel incongruous, and there are various sort of, I suppose, techniques for that. But there's just a few words that you can use or not use, or phrases that you can include, or phrases that you can feel that you will avoid, and that, just from having read a lot of contemporary documents, you do get a feel for, just sort of by osmosis.
Sure, the rhythm and flow of it, and how they would express themselves. So we passed through Christmas, and on page 48 we're in Lent, halfway through Lent. So really, just looking at that, you've got a cold, miserable February rain. We've all been through that. So the setting is really very well done. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So let's see. Okay, so tell us a little bit about this Lent, which I'm sure was done much differently than we do it now.
Well, from my reading, yes, Lent was much more formal at that time. Rather than just being told to give something up for Lent, there was a whole sort of set of rules of fasting, and Catholics who wanted to take those seriously, it would really affect your day-to-day life. There was a limit to how many full meals a day. You were only supposed to eat one full meal, and then you were supposed to just eat sort of lesser meals. There was no meat, of course, for the whole of Lent. In England, opinion was divided in England over whether you were allowed to eat eggs. Some people avoided eggs on fast days, and cheese as well, which to my mind doesn't leave much. And so now, as far as I can make out, small children were not canonically required to fast. So there would be a sort of age difference in that. Also the interesting thing was that in England, at any rate, the Protestants hadn't entirely got rid of Lenten observance. Nobody was supposed to be eating meat in Lent, although the Catholics took fasting much more seriously. There was, many, and there are incidences in the historical record of Catholics actually. It was actually a live moral question for Catholics. If it's a fast day and you're at an inn and you don't eat, if you don't eat dinner because it's meat, then people are going to notice and you're going to get into trouble. Are you still obliged to avoid the meat if you're going to put yourself at risk?
Right.
And that was a live moral question. And casuists tended to say, well, no, you don't actually have to risk arrest, and all this. But again, I've read at least one incident where somebody got arrested and got into trouble, and the suspicions were sparked because somebody noticed that he wasn't eating eggs at an inn. So that was it was something that could become an issue, but wasn't if you were living in your Catholic family where you'd always lived and you'd never not lived in a Catholic household and you'd never had to live away from home. It would just seem normal to you. And again, I've read sort of primary sources which describe this. There was, in one, contemporary source, someone described her father had been sent away to school, and he and his brother decided they were going to fast, and they sort of went through torments of conscience because they insisted on fasting when the rest of the school wasn't. So it's one of those things that a routine part of religion that, in a sense, in a Catholic community can serve the function of creating community and binding community, and it creates a sort of homogeneity. Mm-hmm. But then suddenly it can become a point of conflict, and it's something that isolates you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. good explanation. I think that here on page, let's see, on page the 51, 52, this is really, the dialogue isn't just good. It really is something that I could picture happening, and I like the emotion here. So you start with the Blessed Sacrament, Eucharist, Holy Communion, whichever name you use. And a few lines later, what do you mean made the difference? It is as if the soldiers were spitting in Christ's face, and I stood and I could not sit there. I do not know if it was brave or I just couldn't, but that's all. So the response, but he was thrown off by the passion in Hugh's voice. I've heard of the Mass and all that, but it's not as if, and this is just great. It is precisely as if Christ makes himself as bread for our sake, and Lee stands there and mocks, right? You cannot verily believe that Christ is. And it's like, why do you imagine we risk our necks going to Mass for the sport? So it's like, it's all of a sudden this point where someone is just describing something that has happened, and it's not like he got up and was upset because the Eucharist was being, destroyed, vandalized, whatever. It's because the Eucharist doesn't represent Christ. The Eucharist is Christ, and all of a sudden the man. So you say here, he felt as though he had almost grasped the key to a door which had over and over again been closely closed politely in his face. That's really, to me, it's not just good writing, but I can actually picture that occurring, where people really don't, they know what we believe, or some of what we believe, but it's kind of like, how could they really believe that? And here you have a situation where suddenly this man realizes you really do believe it's Christ. It's such an eye-opener for him. That's really, that's page 51, 52. That's really good. And you have to wonder, what was he thinking? Did he really think that they were just going off to Mass to be daredevils or something, It's like, this is something that's central to their life, Very good.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to convey for anyone who doesn't understand is that Catholicism isn't really a set of beliefs. It's a passion for a person. Mm-hmm. And I have once, not to get too personal, but I was trying to express why I objected to some other students, what I felt was unfairly portraying my religion in a piece of drama, and with some degree of mockery. And they were actually very receptive, and they listened to my concerns, and they did change some of their piece because they, But I remember a teacher saying, but if this is some great deity, why does it hurt him if people are making jokes? And I'm afraid, I suppose I gave my character the sort of eloquence that I didn't have, because I just sort of went, well, as ever, it's only on the way home that you think, what I wanted to say was, that's not the point. It's not whether it hurts him, it's that you don't stand and hear your friend mocked,
right.
Even if it's not going to hurt him.
Yeah.
And it's that you don't, you think that you're sort of satirizing a set of beliefs, but I'm seeing a person.
Yeah.
To me, you might as well, you might as well smack my sister's face. And I suppose that's what I was sort of trying to convey, that it is an emotional impulsion. I mean, belief isn't emotional, but once you have decided that you believe, your commitment to Christ is emotional. It has to be, because it's a commitment between two people.
Yes. That's beautiful.
And so I suppose that's what I was allowing my character to put across.
Mm-hmm. It's not just good writing, though. It really does get to the center of the issue. Many other Christian religions I know have, I guess they call it communion. Maybe some call it the Eucharist, but I don't think that the majority believe that it really is Christ. They think it's a piece of bread. So, So that's a whole different. This whole passage on 51, 52 is very well done. So.
Yeah, I think it does explain. I do think as well that some historians find even historians of religion find religious belief per se difficult to grasp. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, I don't know, it's almost as though we're so busy finding the kind of complex political, geopolitical, tactical, polemical, reasoning behind every event. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say, well, yeah, but had you considered the possibility that that all that may have happened, but it actually also would be a perfectly sufficient explanation in itself that if you don't break the law, you don't get to go to Mass. Mm-hmm. And this is actually in and of itself life-defining for some people. I mean, you can take an incident and argue about it endlessly, but there may be all kinds of other connotations. But it also would have been sufficient in and of itself that these London Catholics in 1591 drew their swords and physically held the door against the soldiers who had arrived until Mass was finished. It would be a sufficient explanation in and of itself that they don't want the Eucharist desecrated. Yes. Like, there may have been all kinds of other things going on too, but that seems to be the last thing that sometimes occurs to scholars, that they might actually have literally believed stuff.
Yeah. So if they were...
maybe.
Yeah.
But it sometimes, even if we are believers ourselves, we kind of sort of forget, and we sort of almost overcomplicating things in a way. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you sort of forget, they might have actually just believed this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. So I think we're coming to the end of our time. I don't know if there's other important points that you want to make sure you get into the interview.
I suppose I just that we've talked a lot, but we haven't really told the story, and my hope that it's that it's a story that is worth reading, and read the story. I suppose the other point I'd like to make is that all my characters are quite deliberately fictional. None of my main characters are real. I deliberately avoided that because I think that's the temptations are too great. So I didn't want to go there. All my characters are fictional, but their setting is real. One or two of the people mentioned are real historical figures. And I think what I've written is fictional people in a factual setting. Yeah. I don't know if you're going to be able to edit the thing to get that in somewhere.
Actually, Sebastian does the editing. But what I like to say to the listeners is I think this book is really good. I think it's worth reading. A lot of us don't necessarily read historical fiction, but this is something that will make you have a sense, I think, of what happens or what happened in the 1500s with persecution against us. But I also think that as you read the book, you will see that there are many things that are talked about that really can be occurring around the world at any time, not necessarily with Catholicism, but with religious persecution. And, the people that are being persecuted are not just whatever religion they are, whether it's Muslim or Jew or Catholic or Buddhist, they're people. And so I think that what you've done is you've given good emotions that are depicted in the dialogue, in the settings, how people are acting. So it's really, although it's historical fiction, it's something that could be placed in many times where religious persecution occurs.
Yeah.
I also think that the character development is very interesting. There are places where conversations occur between a couple of family members, and it's like you would think you were standing there listening to it. So I think this book is well worth the price of buying it. I don't know what the price is, but I can tell you that I think it's worth it. So if you have an opportunity, you should consider buying. Okay, would you like to... go ahead.
I suppose what I'd like to say is this is a historical novel, and it is about Catholics. I don't think you have to be a history buff to like it, and I don't think you have to be a Catholic to like it. I think you just have to like a good story.
Yes.
I hope you just have to like a good story and to be willing to empathize out of your own experience.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's my hope.
That's a good point. Okay. Okay. So would you like to close us in prayer?
Yes. Yes. May I choose a prayer which is actually a sonnet, a poem. It was written in our period by a chap who was actually martyred for his Catholicism at the age of 26. The original was in Latin, and this is a modern translation. But I think the translator captured something of the original. So this is a poem by Thomas Belson, as translated by Michael Hodges. I look about me, sick and faint of soul. The dwelling of God's glory is my goal. But though I look about so constantly, no answer comes, none turns to rescue me. Yet, as I wander through the grassy dale, or higher as the mountain crags I scale, until alone on lonely peaks I gaze, I grieve for having left my Saviour's ways. And when I think how gentle is his touch, and how his justice could demand so much, my mind is changed, my labours seem the less, and I regret my former foolishness. Why should I rail on fortune or repine? Why should I grieve? God's remedy is mine. Endure then, as philosophers maintain, a brave man should, adversity and pain. And might just conclude. Thomas Belson, pray for us.
Amen. Well, thank you very much for this interview. I found it to be very interesting, I think that the listeners will find it interesting too, and I hope many of them will buy your book. It's well worth reading.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Yes. Take care, Lucy.
Take care. Goodbye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.